We are now starting our last portion of the New Testament, the three epistles of the Apostle John. Now, I talked a little bit about them in my introduction to the book of Revelation, which you can watch here. That introduction was primarily the scholarly opinions about the writings of John. I didn't do a lot of the history of John, so we're going to just touch on the scholarly opinions. And those opinions are basically that John didn't really write these things. We have the Gospel of John, his three epistles, and the Revelation of John, but he didn't really write any of these. And there are various opinions. Some people say he did. Some people say he wrote some of them, but not all of them. And there are at least 5 different authors that are proposed for all of the works of John. And they are variously called John the Apostle, or John the son of Zebedee, then John the Beloved, John of Patmos, John the Presbyter, and then there is the theory of the Johannine community, or the followers of John. Now, the Apostle of John, John the Beloved, and John of Patmos are really all the same person, but scholars just don't want to think of them as the same person. John the Presbyter is a different story. He's not mentioned in the scriptures. He is mentioned by 2nd century church fathers, and generally he is listed as separate from John the Apostle. So he probably is not the same person. But if he is not the same person, then he did not write any of these works, because they were all written by John the Apostle. Now, the Johannine community theory, which really has no historical backing, is that there was a community of disciples following John's version of Christianity. They were kind of a separate branch of the Christian faith, and they, or members of the community, wrote these works, probably in the 2nd century. Or maybe late 1st century, but probably was not written by John at all. Now, there are various ways of dividing up the authorship. Very few people think that John wrote all of them, and almost nobody believes that John wrote Revelation. In fact, the only reason we have the separate figure known as John of Patmos is because the man who wrote Revelation states he was on Patmos when he wrote it, and, well, they say it couldn't have been John the Apostle, so it has to be a different John. We'll just call him John of Patmos. But the way they divide it up, besides Revelation being separated, various ways. Some people say one guy wrote the Gospel and one guy wrote the 3 epistles. Some say that one guy wrote the Gospel and 1st John and somebody else wrote 2nd and 3rd John. And sometimes it is somebody wrote the Gospel, somebody wrote 1st John, somebody wrote 2nd and 3rd John, and then somebody wrote Revelation. Or possibly we have 5 different authors, one for the Gospel, one for 1st John, one for 2nd John, one for 3rd John, and one for the Revelation. It's all a mess. But modern prophets affirm that John is the author of all of these writings. And especially in the Gospel, if you pay attention, he really does identify himself not only as John the Beloved, but as the author of the Gospel and the Apostle John. And the Gospel of John it's really a stretch to separate John the Apostle and John the Beloved as 2 different people. But now let us look at these epistles, because that's what we're going to be reading now. Now, the epistles don't state John as their author. They generally simply identify the author as the elder. Now, at the time of their writing, John is the last of the original 12 apostles still alive, and probably the last one to hold that office in the church. All the other apostles have been killed by this point. I believe the last one died in the 80s. So referring to himself as the elder would still be understandable to most of the church at the time. Now, the first epistle of John is written more in the style of a sermon, because it has no introduction or salutation. It's not addressed to anybody, and it has no signing off at the end. So it really feels more like a sermon. Its main theme is the love of God towards men, which is very similar to the Gospel of John, and which is why many people say that the Gospel and the first epistle were written by the same person. It has a very similar tone and purpose. Second epistle of John is addressed to the elect lady. Now, she is not named. It is just the elect lady. She is commended for her faith and is warned against allowing false teachers into her house. Some people think that this is an allegory or metaphor for a congregation, that he's writing to a specific church and calling that church the elect lady. Others think that it was an actual person. The third epistle of John is addressed to a man called Gaius, and it is dealing with another man who has been very inhospitable, or has fluctuated in his hospitality towards the missionaries. And Gaius is being instructed to take authority over this ministry. So those are the 3 epistles of John. Let us talk a little bit of history. We don't really know much about John. John's travels after the death of Christ are not detailed much in the scriptures, and there's very little tradition that I can find about it. In the book of Acts, we know that he was arrested with Peter early on. After Philip, the one of the seven, goes up to Samaria and begins preaching there, later Peter and John go up to confer the Holy Ghost on the people. Shortly after that, we have the persecution under King Agrippa I. And it is during this time that John seems to leave Jerusalem. And he is not mentioned as being present at the Council of Jerusalem in Acts chapter 15. However, in the epistle to the Galatians, Paul does mention that John was in Jerusalem when he returned with Barnabas. He says after 14 years. Some think this was for the Jerusalem Council, so he could have been there. We just don't. It's not definite. After that, though, we have no record of him in the scriptures. He is not mentioned in any of the other epistles, and he just kind of vanishes. I can't find a lot about his travels in other writings either, although my resources right now are fairly limited, so I could be wrong. But this is the way it looks to me. This is how I would present the rest of his history. We know he was translated, so he didn't die. And he had, through this translation, just like the three disciples, in the three Nephite disciples, he would have had power over, they wouldn't have been able to kill him. He would have been able to do many miracles, had displayed great power. So, this is how I see his travels. He's not in Jerusalem, at least not after the Jerusalem Council. He's traveling probably in the Asia Minor area and Syria and possibly out into Mesopotamia area, but he settles eventually in Ephesus, most likely after Paul is executed, and he comes here to kind of take over the governance of the area. In the 80s, during the reign of Domitian, Emperor of Rome, who reigns, I believe, from 81 to 96, and persecutes the Christians, he is arrested, brought to Rome, where he is thrown into a pot of boiling oil in the Colosseum as a great show for all the Romans. But, like the three Nephites, he is unharmed. And after boiling him for a while, and he just steps out of the pot of boiling oil without a mark on him, it is said that all the spectators, or at least a good portion of them, were converted to the Christian faith, witnessing this miracle. Domitian, in anger, banishes him to the island of Patmos. This would be sometime in the late 80s, 86, 87, where he stays until the death of Domitian. In 95, he writes the Revelation of John, while on the island of Patmos. In 96, Domitian dies, and John is freed from the island. He is able to leave. He returns to Ephesus, where he again ministers and supports the churches in Asia. While in Ephesus, he writes his three epistles, and likely the gospel as well. I think he probably wrote the gospel first, then his epistles, but all of this was probably written after he returned to Ephesus from Patmos. So after the year 95, and even likely into the 1st century. I think it is Irenaeus who then states that he stayed in Ephesus until the days of Trajan, or in the days of Trajan he left, he died. Now we know he was translated, he didn't die. But like the three Nephites, he is later removed from the people as the people start becoming too wicked. Now when was he removed from the people? I don't know. He seems to have vanished from all records during the reign of Trajan. Most Christians believe that he died of old age. He is said to be the only one of the original apostles that died of old age, that did not die as a martyr. He is also one of only 3 of the early Christians who did not leave behind any bodily relics that are venerated in the modern day, the other 2 being Mary and Joseph. And because of this, there are some who believe the term is he was assumed into heaven, meaning his body and spirit were taken into heaven before the resurrection. Other people, just like Mary and Joseph, also are said to be assumed into heaven, like Elijah and Enoch. Basically, it's the doctrine of translated beings. They call it an assumption, but its translation is what it is. Their examples are Enoch and Elijah, who we know were translated. That's what it is. And John left no bodily relic behind because he was also translated. Now, of course, I don't really believe in all these relics. We know that many of these men and women were resurrected. Peter and James were resurrected when they appeared to Joseph Smith. So it's a fun tradition, but we know that John was truly resurrected, and he just kind of disappears from history. I don't know exactly when these epistles were written. In my opinion, they could have been written as late as the mid, even late 2nd century, because John would have still been alive and likely would have still been around. He may not have been directly involved in the governance of the church anymore, but I think he would have been around probably until the time, although he may have been taken out of the people, taken out from among the people, just like the third Nephites, but he was taken out earlier, taken out during the reign of Trajan, which I believe was 96 to 117. So somewhere in there, he is probably translated, or he's probably taken out of the world. But that is our history of John, and now let us read his epistles.